When Moses met with the Lord at the burning bush, he wanted to know God's name. And he had a reason for wanting to know God's name, that God had given him this huge task, this huge mission to go down and back into Egypt, to speak to Pharaoh, to tell Pharaoh to let God's people go. And God had promised to go with Moses and use Moses to bring about the deliverance of his people. And so Moses is asking what he's to say to God's people when he goes down into Egypt, because he's not sure. Are they going to believe him? Are they going to trust that God has spoken to him? And so he's looking for confirmation that he can trust God in this call and that God will fulfill his word and his promise. And so he asks the Lord for his name. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 13, Moses says, that he asks the Lord what he's to say is his name. And the Lord answers in verse 14 and says to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. I am who I am is the name that the Lord gives to Moses and tells him to tell the people that it is I am who has sent him. The Lord gives his name. Now, in the Bible, a name isn't just a label so that you can get someone's attention or something like that, but it reveals who someone is. And so God is revealing his very identity with his name by saying, I am who I am. I am. The Lord is simply the one who is. He simply is who he is. His existence is identical to his essence. We see Jesus saying something very similar in John's Gospel. Not only in John's Gospel does Jesus use that name, I am, of himself, but he also says that he is the life. Jesus says in John 14, verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He doesn't just say that he lives. He doesn't just say that he has life, but rather that's who he is. He is the life. His existence is identical to the life. That's who he is. We see in Scripture God being identified in different things, in different ways, that God is light in 1 John chapter 1, verse 5. God is love in 1 John chapter 4, verse 8. God is spirit, Jesus tells us in John chapter 4, verse 24. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 29, we read that our God is a consuming fire. It's not just simply that God has some light, but God is light. In him there's no darkness at all. It's not just that God has some love sometimes. No, God is love. God is spirit. God is a consuming fire. These aren't just bits of God or things that God sometimes is, but this is the identity of God. God is light, always. God is love, always. God is spirit, always. God is a consuming fire, always. That is who he is. This is the identity of God. He's not sometimes love and sometimes light and sometimes spirit and sometimes a consuming fire. He's not switching round between all of them. Not sometimes one, sometimes another. But rather, if God is light, God is love, God is spirit, God is a consuming fire, if he is the life, then all of these are identical in God. These are all ways of describing who God is, describing the essence of God. We can see this when God reveals himself to Moses in Exodus chapter 33. Moses says to the Lord, please show me your glory, in verse 18. He asks to see God's glory, and God responds by saying, I will make my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. So Moses asks to see God's glory, and God responds by showing his goodness and revealing his name, the Lord, which was the name he spoke at the burning bush when he said, I am. So God's goodness is identical to his glory, is identical to his name, which is, I am who I am. So you can't divide God up into his goodness and his glory and his life and his love and his consuming fire and his spirit and all these different. There aren't lots of bits in God. You can't divide God, but rather all his attributes are identical with his being. This is the doctrine of divine simplicity. It might sound really strange, but think of a stained glass window. When we look at a stained glass window, think if you're in a cathedral somewhere, it's dark, but it's a sunny day outside and the light is streaming through the windows, and you see all these colours hitting the stonework in the cathedral as the light comes through the stained glass window. But we know that the light is one, that there isn't some green light and some red light and some blue light, and there aren't lots of different coloured lights coming through. However, the light of the sun is all the same, but as we see it reflected through the window, that we see all these different colours of light coming. And that's a bit like the attributes of God. God is one. God is simple. All his attributes are identical to who he is. But as we see God acting, we see in different ways that we can understand that as we look at different things God has done, that we see his love manifest. We see his holiness. We see his justice. These are all identical in God, but we see them in different ways, just like the different colours of light we see through the stained glass window. In Psalm 119, verse 68, the psalmist says to the Lord, "You are good and you do good." What God does reflects who he is. So in God's actions, as he reveals his justice, as he reveals his holiness, as he reveals his love, as we see those different bits of the stained glass window, that's revealing the reality of the divine essence of who God is. Now, you might be wondering, what's this got to do with me? Well, this is really important in salvation. We see the simplicity of God in our salvation. And because when Jesus died for us, it's not like a battle between the wrath of God and the love of God, or between the justice of God and the mercy of God, or something like this. As A.W. Tozer put it, when God justifies a sinner, everything in God is on the sinner's side. All the attributes of God are on the sinner's side. It isn't that mercy is pleading for the sinner and justice is trying to beat him to death. No. All of God does all that God does. So, because our God is the simple God, because his attributes are identical with his essence, because you can't divide him up into parts, there isn't a bit of God on our side and a bit of God against us. But the God who saves us is the God who is for us completely. God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. There's no dark bit of God that we need to be fearing, but rather God in his mercy and grace, the God who is mercy and grace, the God who is gracious and compassionate as he revealed himself to Moses, is the God who in all that he is has acted for us and for our salvation.